Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm privileged to welcome a very, very accomplished and senior professor of marketing from Cambridge, UK, Professor Jaideep Prabhu. Professor Prabhu, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Ashutosh. Delighted to be with you.
Thank you. Jaideep is a professor of marketing at the Cambridge Judge Business School. He's an author of several books. His one book where he was a co-author was titled The Jugaad Innovation, Think Frugal, Be Flexible, Generate Breakthrough Growth, described by The Economist as the most comprehensive book yet on the subject of frugal innovation. Then he wrote a book titled Frugal Innovation, How to Do Better with Less in 2016. And his latest book, which we will talk about, is How Should a Government Be? The New Levers of State Power. So Jaideep, before we start talking marketing, tell me a little bit about your own journey in brief.
Absolutely, Ashutosh. So I grew up in India. I studied engineering as an undergraduate there at IIT Delhi. I then went to the US and switched from engineering to business. I got a PhD at the University of Southern California in marketing.
Yeah.
I taught at UCLA and Tilburg University in the Netherlands before moving to Cambridge. I was at Cambridge for a few years, then went to Imperial College in London before returning to Cambridge. And as you said, I'm a professor of marketing. I've been very interested in innovation throughout my career, and particularly recently, innovation in emerging economies like India and what I call frugal innovation.
Amazing, amazing. So let's spend the next few minutes talking about marketing. And my first question is, what, in your opinion, are some of the key challenges and opportunities brands face in today's rapidly changing business landscape?
Great question, Ashutosh. Three, I think, big things, which are both challenges and opportunities. So first, I think, is this perfect storm of challenges around the world to do with climate change and environment, but also social issues like inequality. So that's one big challenge for brands, but also an opportunity. Second is the rise of social media, the sort of prevalence of social media in our lives and digital more generally. Again, huge challenge for brands, but also many, many opportunities. And a third would be the rise of emerging economies and the very large numbers of people who are joining the formal economy and driving growth from emerging economies. Again, big challenge, but also a huge opportunity for global brands.
Fascinating. And, given the explosion of social media, what do you see the role of branding and how do you see it evolve?
So social media, as we were just saying, big challenge, but also big opportunity. And what it has done for brands and marketers is that it has sort of taken control away from the marketer and given more of it to the consumer, and not just your immediate direct target consumer, but anyone else who wants to engage with your brand. So your ability to focus on your core customer, which is still very important, is tested, because now you can't control your messages. You can't put out only certain types of information and expect your consumers to very passively accept it. Consumers have a lot of information. They have a lot of power. They have their own channels. They can even organize into brand communities. And it's not just your core target consumers. It's anyone who wants to engage with your brand. So that's just opened up the whole world, in a sense, to engage with your brand, which is a challenge, because how do you manage so many different types of people? But it's also an opportunity because you can get so many more people engaging with you.
Correct. Well said. And, when I was preparing to talk to you, I was thinking 4.5 decades ago, when I started as a 22-year-old in marketing, there used to be those big billboards. There used to be cinema advertising, full page ads in magazines, newspapers. Today, everything has changed. The paradigm of branding has changed. My question is, what are some of the common mistakes that a lot of brands are making in their marketing efforts, and how can they avoid them?
Yeah, great question. So, this is it. Your ability and the channels and opportunities you have to engage with your consumers has just
Mm.
vastly expanded.
Correct.
Because it's not as if those channels that you mentioned, which you used at the start of your career, have gone away. Those
Mm.
remain important.
Mm.
And in certain markets with certain consumers, certain types of products, you
Correct.
still have to use those channels
Mm.
and you have to master those channels. And in fact, there's a proliferation of those channels. Just think
Mm.
about TV, for instance.
Correct.
When we were growing up in India, there was Doordarshan
Mm.
1, maybe there was 2, right? People growing up in the UK, there was BBC 1, BBC 2. Now there's just with cable TV and satellite,
Correct.
I mean, just, like in India
Absolutely.
alone. So there are those traditional channels which you've got to still manage, and there's a proliferation of those. But then on top of it, you
Mm.
have social media, and every day there's a new kind of platform that comes up. Some are very broad based, like if
Mm.
you take X or Instagram, something like that, very broad based. Some are quite niche, very
Mm.
specific to a particular segment or a particular market. So just keeping abreast of all these different channels and also how they operate. Like Marshall McLuhan's old distinction between hot media and cold media still,
Mm.
holds. And of course, there are all kinds of things in between.
Mm.
So certain types of media will do certain things for you, and you need to know what they will do and when to use them and how to
Mm.
use them, how to
Mm.
evaluate them.
Mm.
So, you make mistakes because the complexity has increased.
Correct.
And you could put out a message in one place, and then word gets around that, let's say you make some claims around green, and
Mm.
somebody does some investigative journalism and puts out something on Twitter or on
Mm.
LinkedIn, and there, boom, all your investments, your carefully controlled messaging
Mm.
is amounts to naught. So a lot of pressure on you to get your messaging right, to be authentic,
Mm.
not to be making claims you cannot back up, but
Mm.
equally not being shy about making claims you can back up.
Mm. Well said. And Jesse, what role does storytelling play in building a brand's identity? Because now everyone seems to have become a storyteller.
Storytelling is absolutely key, Ashutosh. You probably know this from your own work and also from having these kinds of interviews, right? You can't just list facts. If you want to engage an audience,
Mm.
you have to use emotion, you have to use drama, you have to tell anecdotal stories along with stats, right?
Mm.
And you've got
Mm.
to weave it all together.
Mm.
And so advertisers have known this, and so have novelists and musicians, artists, politicians,
Mm.
and brands can learn from all of them. So storytelling is key. And there are some universal sort of appeals,
Mm.
universal ways of telling a story,
Mm.
universal structures, and so on, which you can learn from. But there are also specific aspects, cultural
Correct.
aspects, where
Mm.
certain types of stories do better in certain communities or groups. So
Mm.
you really have to be a master storyteller to be a good marketer.
Mm. Mm. Well said. My next question to you is on data and analytics. That people are saying data is the next oil, data is next gold, and whatever else. But how can brands leverage data and analytics to better understand their target audience and improve their own campaigns?
We talked earlier about social media
Yeah.
and digital. That's a big, big trend, right? Explosive. And what that brings is data. And, there are all these cliches data is the new oil, but it's true in a way. It's a huge resource. And brands that have understood this, those that were born digital, that
Mm.
actually built their whole business around a digital platform where they are collecting data even as they're doing business.
Mm.
So, take Amazon. Every time somebody goes on the Amazon platform, they leave a footprint which Amazon is collecting and analyzing. Even
Right.
if you just visit and search, then if you buy and you do a transaction, then they collect all this data, they analyze it, they use AI, and they get insight, and they can even follow up with recommendations. That's
Mm.
amazing. That whole market research cycle
Correct.
that you would have to
Correct.
do in a very complex way, very expensive, it was very scattershot, is done so precisely, automatically, fluidly, and inexpensively.
Mm.
So that kind of data that's crucial for brands. But
Mm.
there's also data that's not coming from your website. It's coming
Mm.
from other websites. We mentioned, people talking about your brand on Twitter, people in your target group, but also anyone who engages with your brand on
Right.
LinkedIn. on Instagram, on Reddit, places like that. Unstructured data in sort of semi-grammatical, multilingual. Now you can process that data using, again, all kinds of machine learning and sort of natural language processing tools and get insight. You can pick up trends. Where are, your brands being picked up by whom? What kind of messages? How can you use that? You mentioned storytelling. How can you use their words to tell them a story back to them about your brand? So huge opportunities.
Well said. And the other perspective I wanted to get your views on is the entire shift towards the social and environmental consciousness, and that too amongst the young consumers. So my question is, how can brands integrate sustainability and social responsibility into their marketing strategies?
I've been very interested in that question. I've been studying this myself for about 5 or 6 years now, along with some co-authors and PhD students and so on. And I've done interviews with a lot of companies, from especially the upper echelons, but also going into middle management, and both the leaders, but also specifically marketing leaders, to understand how this huge challenge of climate change, all these concerns around ESG and regulations as well, around environmental performance, social performance, governance issues, alongside performance and profits. So it's not like you can do one at the expense of the other. How do companies now and brands balance that? That's a big question. And you mentioned storytelling. So for the companies themselves, they've realized they've got to figure out what is their story that they can tell others and themselves, their own employees, especially younger people who they want to employ, the next generation of consumers, regulators, the world at large, civil society. What is a story they can tell authentically about themselves, that this is our purpose in the world? This is how we are making a difference. Not only, to give you something you want, which you will pay for, and we will make a revenue and we will make a profit, but also we're doing this in a way that is environmentally sustainable, if not actually beneficial, that is socially sustainable, beneficial, and we have transparent governance, we have accountable governance. So a lot of brands are trying to come up with that purpose, thinking about what is their heritage, what can they authentically promise the world, and then try to live up to that promise. So I think there's a lot that is happening in this space. It's challenging, no doubt, but it comes back to some of the core things we were talking about: storytelling, engagement, using the tools at your disposal.
Thank you. The other thing that is being spoken about a lot are the ethical considerations in marketing and advertising, especially when it comes to targeting vulnerable groups. And one thing that has often been spoken about are the whitening creams, for example. What are your thoughts on how do marketers handle some of the ethical issues?
Ethical issues have always been a concern for marketers, right? Marketers have always, you can do good, and then, you intend to do good, but there's some unintended consequence. Or, there's some product or service you offer which people may want, but may not necessarily be good for them, or as a side effect. Even think about drugs or pharmaceuticals. They intend to cure you or protect you from some illness, but there could be side effects. And of course, those vary from person to person. So ethical issues are a huge concern. And now this is, of course, become even bigger an issue because of social media. That is, you could put out a story which is authentic, or you intend, to do some good in the world, but somebody finds that it's doing some negative. Let's take the case you gave, the whitening cream. So we have Unilever, a global brand operating in so many different regions. They have been very committed for a long time, since their origin, to not only doing well as a business, but also improving people's lives. They had brands like Dove that have made a very big deal of, helping young people not only look good and feel good, but also, to have a balanced sense of what beauty is and all this kind of stuff, and be comfortable with themselves. But then they also have brands like Fair and Lovely that send a very different message in a different part of the world. In the past, maybe the two groups would not find out about each other and you get away with it. Not anymore, right? So that's a great example of the challenges we face today with a globalized world, with digital media. You lose control of your messaging. You have to be authentic. It's very difficult. There are tensions.
Fantastic. Thank you. And my last question on marketing before I move to your books. How has globalization impacted brand management and marketing strategies?
It just increased the complexity. As we were discussing with the Unilever case, right? You are operating in so many different regions, so
Mm,
many different products, so many different target segments.
mm,
You'll be putting out messages about a particular brand in one region, which works in that region, but doesn't work in another region.
right.
That same message has to be adapted. Maybe you've not got around to adapting it, or maybe you can't adapt it
Mm,
without it, just being totally inauthentic.
mm,
I think, also one of the things that I study a lot is, as I said, emerging economies doing what I call frugal innovation, or what we call jugaad in India. So trying
mm,
to develop something highly affordable, say for an emerging market. Let's say you're GE, you come up with a highly affordable medical device for India or
mm,
China. But then you have this conundrum. Do you take it back to the US where it could cannibalize your own sales of higher end, higher
mm,
margin medical devices?
mm,
So these are some of the challenges that brands are facing in a globalized world. How to
mm.
operate in so many different regions and be consistent.
Amazing. Thank you. So let's talk about your books. Your first book was Jugaad Innovation, Think Frugal, Be Flexible, Generate Breakthrough Growth. Second, you said was Frugal Innovation. So before I come to your latest book, tell me a little bit about your first two books.
Yeah. So the first book was a book with my co-authors Navi and Simone, and it was all about how innovation is done in emerging economies like India, where
Mm,
you have severe resource constraints on the supply side, and on the demand side, you have a large number of people who are lower income but aspirational.
mm,
So it was all about how do, in the first instance, domestic companies in countries like India and China
mm,
come up with affordable, inclusive innovation.
mm,
But it was also about how can Western brands going into those markets learn from their emerging market counterparts?
mm,
Because typically Western brands innovation was an expensive activity, high end, high margins, and then it
mm,
trickles down, but
mm.
the economics work differently in emerging markets. So that's what that first book, Jugaad Innovation, was
Okay.
all about.
And the second one, which was Frugal Innovation.
So the Jugaad book came out in 2012. It was very well received, not only in emerging markets like India, but also in the West, where the
Mm,
press noticed and companies noticed.
mm,
So we then started to look at this notion of frugal innovation in the West for the West. And we
mm,
realized that in the West, a lot of these large companies who are learning about frugal innovation in emerging economies, but also seeing startups in the West being very frugal and eat their lunch,
mm,
these large corporations were now saying, how can we do frugal innovation in our own organizations,
mm,
large, complex organizations? So that second book came out in 2015, and it was all about how large Western companies across sectors, from
mm,
automotive, pharmaceutical, banking, FMCG, education, etc., were trying to do frugal innovation within a large organization alongside more structured long-term innovation.
amazing. So now let me move to your latest book. How should a government be the new levers of state power? And before I ask you a question, I'm going to ask all our viewers and listeners to go and check out Professor Jaideep Prabhu's book. I'm going to check it out myself. So, what was your hypothesis when you wrote this book?
So, I had, as I said, written the Jugaad book and the Frugal book, which was really about the private sector.
Correct.
And there was some talk in those books, were some examples or cases that were of social businesses,
Hmm.
but it was really in the private sector. And whenever I would talk about those books to any audience, somebody would invariably ask me, so what does this mean for governments?
Hmm.
And I realized that what they meant was there were two aspects to that question. One is they were asking, can governments also do frugal innovation in
Hmm.
their products and services that they deliver to their citizens in
Right.
education, health, licenses, whatever, right?
Hmm.
Social security payments, all that kind of stuff. But there was another question they were asking, which was what is the role of governments in regulating and also cultivating these new technologies that help people to frugally
Right.
innovate?
Right.
Um, so that's what drove me to write this book about innovation in government and the public sector.
Hmm.
And very much like the previous books, I looked at lots of cases from around the world of governments doing it and tried to extract some principles of how they
Hmm.
should do that.
Hmm. Very interesting. You talk about the new levers of state power. What are some of these new levers and how do they differ from the traditional methods of governing?
So there are two main levers that I consider. One
Hmm.
is technology, new technologies, particularly digital and data. You know,
Right.
very much as digital and data have completely revolutionized the private sector,
Hmm.
there are now huge opportunities in the public sector. So technological levers is one.
Hmm.
The other lever is organizational innovation that's happened, new
Right.
forms of organizations, which I've written about extensively in the private sector in the Frugal and Jugaad book, which is
Hmm.
where, for instance, now small teams, even within large organizations, not to mention startups,
Hmm.
small teams can now do things that only large companies or the government could have done 10 or 20 years ago, and faster, better, cheaper.
Right.
You could take WhatsApp, four guys coming up with software, or like in Cambridge, we have some of my colleagues came up with this cheap computer and hardware called Raspberry Pi. Huge developments, create huge value, create
Hmm.
huge wealth, and so on. Small teams done quickly, very affordably. So that is the other thing. Organization. How does government rethink how it's structured, how
Hmm.
the bureaucracy can function, and bring
Right.
in partners? So those are the two levers.
Very interesting. But the other question that, and I've spoken to so many government people, they always have to strike a balance between ensuring welfare and sustainability and a whole lot of other things. What are your thoughts on how can policy makers strike this balance?
So I thought a lot about that, Ashutosh, because, yes, it's one thing to say, government can do what the private sector, if the private sector can do this, then government should do it.
Absolutely.
But governments are a bit different from companies, and when I talked to technocrats, bureaucrats, politicians, they would always emphasize this, that there are some ways in which, yes, governments operate like companies and they can learn from that, but there are some things that are very different. So
Correct.
one is, companies can be very targeted in terms of who their customers are, and they can
Mm.
fire customers they don't want.
Mm.
Governments can't do that. They have to be inclusive. They have
Right.
to think about all the different groups in society and balance their concerns.
Mm.
Then, yes, governments have to think about economic growth. That's a big obsession of governments. But then they also have to do that sustainably. They have to think about the environment. So,
Correct.
whereas many companies have externalized all those costs, and
Mm.
actually passed them on to the government,
True. True.
now you have legislation. So, and then governments have to not only cultivate these technologies and encourage them, but they also have to regulate them, which is again another tension. So, governments have quite a lot of their work cut out for them. They have a lot of these challenges that companies don't.
Mm.
And I get into that, and I say that governments need certain principles to guide them when they adopt these new technologies and these new organizational forms,
Mm.
so that they can, so they have to be responsible. So they have to be responsive to citizens, they have to be inclusive, they have to be experimental, they have to be entrepreneurial, and they have to be innovative. So
Mm.
there are some ways in which governments are different, and there are principles to guide them in doing that.
Mm. Well said. I have time for two more questions for you. My next question is, how do you see the role of branding and communication in shaping public perception and trust in government? And what can governments do to build stronger connections with their citizens?
Crucial question, huge question. In fact, this is at the center of my book. As a
Mm.
marketing person
Mm.
and having studied the private sector and how important it is in the private sector, we were saying earlier, to have
Yeah.
that relationship, trusted relationship with your customer
Mm.
through storytelling, authenticity, all these kinds of things. I think a lot of that applies in government as well, except governments have not had to think about it in the same way.
Right.
Governments have been very inside out and top down,
Mm.
telling the citizen what they should do. But
Mm.
now citizens can fight back,
Mm.
especially through, the power shift has happened.
Mm.
So citizens fight back, and citizens can organize very quickly on social media and push back and so on. So governments have their work cut out for them in trying to be more citizen centric, to
Mm.
really try and take citizens seriously, their needs seriously, listen to them, gather data on them, get insight, and then work backwards to come
Mm.
up with solutions. And
Mm.
I think doing that then makes governments more authentic in delivering for their citizens. And that's key. I think a lot of the lack of trust in government is that governments are just often quite inefficient and incompetent and remote from the citizen and the needs of the citizen. No matter
Mm.
what politicians may say, the actual functioning of government is remote,
Mm.
and not responsive. And
Yeah.
so that's why there's this lack of trust. There is a big gap between what politicians are saying that they will do because consumers are demanding it, and their ability to deliver.
Mm.
So I think, that's why adopting these new technologies, responsibly, of course, and these new organizational forms, to be able to walk the talk is crucial in government. Once you're able to do that reliably, I think, things will follow.
Yes.
And branding and communication is very important to get people along when you're trying to make these changes. So a great example, which I talk about in my book, is what India has achieved in the last 10 years, starting with the Aadhaar ID, which was a brilliant form of communication with the citizen. It was not mandated. It was voluntary, and it convinced people that, hey, I should do this. I'll line up if it takes me to get this ID, because it's going to help me. Branding and communications was key. And then on the back of that, so many other things have followed, including financial inclusion and bringing people from the informal economy into the formal economy.
Great response. Thank you. And my last question to you: how do cultural, social, and political differences impact the way governments function? And are there any universal principles that can be applied across diverse contexts?
We touched on this a little bit in the private sector context with globalization. The same thing, I think, holds in the government context. And I was very conscious of that while writing the book. So on the one hand, I think that governments have the same challenges and concerns around the world. There are some similarities, there's no doubt. Their promise, their social contract is very similar. Their challenges are very similar at the moment, whether you're rich or you're emerging. But yes, you're right. There are differences. Economically, there are differences.
Correct.
In a country like India, the challenge is, how do you bring half the population that's outside the formal economy into the formal economy? So affordability is key, and inclusivity is really key. In the West, maybe the concerns are, generally speaking, less about inequality of that kind, but more about climate change and sustainable growth and things like that. And so there will be some economic variations. There's some cultural variations. In just some cultures are more individualistic and value more individual privacy. Other cultures are more collectivistic, and privacy is not that much a concern, but security is. And that's key when you look at things like the use of data and digital and so on, property rights. So yes, there are some, I think, universal issues, but there are also, one has to be sensitive to economic and cultural variation.
Amazing. I could just keep talking to you. You have so much knowledge that one can learn from, but I do have to stop because we're running out of time. But on that note, Professor Prabhu, thank you so much for speaking to me about your journey. Thank you for talking to me about so many different aspects of marketing. And it's incredible the way you have related marketing to so many different aspects of human beings, technology, government, and sustainability and all other requirements that are there for society today. Thank you also for speaking to me about your 3 books, and in more particular, your latest book, How Should a Government Be? The New Levers of State Power. Thank you again for speaking to me, and good luck. Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for The Brand Called You.